Long before Ulysses S. Grant's first term was over, a reaction against corruption in the administration, as I mentioned, Grant had 42 relatives on the payroll, most of them being from his wife's family, had brought about trouble within the Republican Party, leading in 1872 to the creation of a new party, the Liberal Republicans. It was an election year, and they called for a national convention. As their candidate, they chose Horace Greeley, editor and founder of the New York Tribune, a frail figure who spoke in a high-pitched whine and dressed in ill-fitting clothes. The Democrats also endorsed Greeley as their candidate. Grant carried the election. Greeley only took 6 southern and border states and none in the north. Greeley's wife had died during the campaign, and worn out with grief and fatigue, he too was gone 3 weeks after the election. Within less than a year of his re-election, Grant was in the middle of serious scandal. During the campaign of 1872, the public first learned about the Credit Mobilier, a construction company which had taken the Union Pacific Railroad for exorbitant fees to line the pockets of insiders who controlled both firms. Basically, major stockholders in the Union Pacific Railroad formed a company, the Credit Mobilier of America, and gave it contracts to build its share of the Transcontinental Railroad. They sold or gave shares in this construction to influential congressmen. It was a lucrative deal for the congressmen because they helped themselves by approving federal subsidies for the cost of railroad construction without paying much attention to expenses, enabling railroad builders to make huge profits. When the New York Sun broke the story on the eve of the 1872 election, Speaker of the House James G. Blaine, a Maine Republican implicated in the scandal, set up a congressional committee to investigate. The beneficiaries had included Speaker Schuyler Colfax, later Vice President during Grant's first term, and Representative James Garfield, later President. This had occurred before Grant's election in 1868, but it touched a number of prominent Republicans and, by association, him. Of 13 members of Congress involved, only 2, Oakes Ames of Massachusetts and James Brooks of New York, were censored by Congress. Basically, they got a slap on the wrist. Even more disclosures soon followed. Secretary of War W. W. Belknap, turned out, had accepted bribes up to the tune of $24,000 from Indian traders dispersing supplies at Army posts in the West. He had appointed Caleb Marsh to maintain a trading establishment at Fort Sill, in what is now Oklahoma, on consideration of a certain sum of money to be paid quarterly to Belknap or his wife. He was impeached but resigned in time to elude trial by the Senate. Before Grant's second term ended, the corruption crossed the Atlantic when General Robert Schenck, minister to London, unloaded worthless stock and Emma mines on gullible Englishmen. Only a plea of diplomatic immunity and a sudden exit spared him from British justice. During 1873, the market for railroad bonds turned sour, as some 25 roads defaulted on their interest payments before the end of August. The investment banking firm of J. Cook & Company went bankrupt in September, and the ensuing stampede forced the stock market to close for 10 days. The economic panic of 1873 set off a depression that lasted for 6 years, the longest and most severe that Americans had yet suffered, marked by widespread bankruptcies, unemployment, and a drastic slowdown in railroad building. As the Depression deepened, things began heating up on the frontier between Native Americans and the Army. In 1874, an expedition led by George A. Custer discovered gold in the Black Hills, the land most sacred to the Sioux. When government attempts to persuade the Indians to sell or lease the land failed, they were ordered to vacate. They refused, and war erupted. On the morning of June 22, 1876, the 7th Cavalry, led by Lieutenant Colonel George A. Custer, passed in review before General Alfred Terry and Colonel John Gibbon. The idea was that Custer would rendezvous with them for a final campaign against the Sioux. Frustrated by long, fruitless pursuits, Custer was determined to fight it out whenever and wherever he could. That is why on June 25th, when his scouts discovered a Sioux camp and warriors near the Little Bighorn River in present-day Montana, Custer decided not to wait until the next day, when he was supposed to rendezvous with the others. He also thought that his troops had been sighted, and so was afraid that the Indians would just disappear. That had happened to him before in some other battles, so it wasn't without precedent that he might think that. So first, Custer sent Captain Frederick Benteen with 125 men south to make sure that the Sioux had not moved to the upper valley of the Little Bighorn. Then he sent another 112 men under Major Marcus A. Reno in pursuit of a small body of warriors he had sighted. With his remaining troops, Custer planned to charge the Sioux village. Spiritual leader for the Sioux was Chief Sitting Bull. The military commander will be Crazy Horse. Custer charged only to be engulfed by massive numbers of Sioux warriors, its estimated 2,500, who killed the colonel and 250 of his men. Reno, joined by Ben Teen, held off a relentless siege for the next 2 days. The Battle of the Little Bighorn was the last major Native American victory of the Indian Wars. In later engagements, the Sioux were defeated by the Army's two most successful Indian fighters, Ranald Mackenzie and Nelson A. Miles. Chief Sitting Bull escaped to Canada only to return to the Sioux reservation several years later. Crazy Horse was captured and murdered by his guard. The Battle of Little Bighorn occurred during the middle of the country's celebration of the centennial. So to say that the country was stunned is an understatement. It was quite an embarrassment. That embarrassment is going to lead to a stronger army and the eventual defeat of all Native American tribes. Little Bighorn also happened during the middle of another presidential election, one that was quite pivotal. By the way, 8 million people came to the centennial. You could see George Washington's coat, vest, and pants, 40-foot-long arm and torch of the Statue of Liberty, real-looking artificial teeth, Ben Franklin's printing press, and telephones, because now the telephone has been developed by Alexander Graham Bell, and it is going to be on display here. And so it was quite a thing to be able to go to this centennial celebration. Also, during this time period of Reconstruction, you've got the passage of the 13th Amendment, 14th Amendment, and 15th Amendment to the Constitution. You will want to make certain that you know what each one of those did. And so that brings us to the end of the course. You're going to have the Compromise of 1877, which will officially end Reconstruction. And it's at that point that the next semester actually starts.